I'm Goldie Blumenstyk. I'm a senior writer with the Chronicle of Higher Education. Welcome you all to this session today. I should tell you from the outset, I don't plan to keep you here for 45 minutes, but we are happy to. I'm here with some colleagues, and we're certainly happy to stay afterwards and chat with you a little bit about the trends report. I have a colleague who's sitting at the window there, Scott Carlson, who's the author of the work report that we mentioned also in the handouts that I hope some of you received at least, and he'd be happy to talk to you about that as well afterwards, as well as my colleague, Jen Diorio, who's a senior director, and our managing editor, Scott Smallwood, all of whom are sitting in the windowsill over here. And we'd all be happy to stick around afterwards and take some questions. I hope some of you have picked up a copy of the report. I have to say we underestimated the fortitude of people to get up at 9:15 in the morning for the first day of the conference. If you didn't get a copy of the report, please give me your business card or give a business card to one of those people on there, put a little note on there. We'll be sure we get you one if you were at this session. We want to be sure anyone who got here for the session gets a copy of the report. The Trends Report is a report that the Chronicle has now become an annual feature. The report is the work of, I'm the person lucky enough to be standing up here to present it to you today, but it's certainly not just me who's done it. It's the work of the whole newsroom of the Chronicle of Higher Education. The report is edited by Carolyn Mooney, who also edits a lot of our other special sections, including ones that you may be familiar with, the Digital Campus Edition, which is about sort of tech and higher ed, and also the Next issue, which covers a lot of issues about innovation in higher education. And Carolyn and I put together this PowerPoint, so we get the publicity on the shot here. Just for one brief quick commercial, the Chronicle, we've started this new feature we call, it's sort of a theme that we've been covering in higher education. We call it Relearning, Mapping the New Education Landscape. I'm sure a lot of you in this room are getting our Tuesday morning newsletter, which is free. We wrap up a lot of the interesting issues that have happened that week, a lot of our stories that kind of cover the changing landscape in higher ed, about teaching and learning and technology. If you're not already getting that, you can go to chronicle.com/relearning and sign up for that free newsletter. End of commercial. So the Trends Report. Last year, our Trends Report reflected, I would say, sort of the growing upheaval in higher education, broadly. And this year, look at 2017, it reflects a different set of tensions. Last year was a lot more external, and this year I would think it's a lot more external. It sort of reflects the changing nature of what's going on in higher education. So our trend number one, these are not ranked in any particular order, although at the end I'd be interested to hear what people think were some of the trends that you are finding on campuses, and if you're thinking which ones you think are the most salient. First trend is information literacy. It's a challenge. We all know the discussions that we're hearing in the news about fake news. Apparently in France, they're better at discerning fake news from non-fake news than we are in the United States of America. But it's becoming a big issue on college campuses, and we're starting to see colleges react to this change in some significant ways. A lot of you have heard about this Stanford study, and there's also this broader challenge that what students today need to sort of understand the differences in fake news and discerning news. It requires some technical skills as well as some common sense. More people may need to learn a little bit more about how algorithms work and how search engines work so that they understand the information that they're getting. The other things that are sort of fascinating to us is one of the reasons we think this is becoming a challenge on campuses is a lot of students are not getting quite the exposure to the humanities and the general education courses that they were probably getting in earlier years. A lot more students are a little more focused on majors, sort of career-focused majors, and they're not getting exposed to some of the disciplines that might help them become more discerning readers. And campuses are reacting to that. In some cases, places like Purdue University have created almost like mini curricula sort of designed to help students better discern and understand news and figure out fake news from real news. And there's also this just broader discussion of this concept called meta-literacy, which is this whole idea where students need to be trained as both consumers and creators of content to sort of understand the differences around information and what's real and what's not, and understanding authority in the media that they consume. Our next trend is activist athletes. A lot of you have been following this in the professional sports world with Colin Kaepernick. We've also seen a lot of instances on college campuses, most famously a year ago at the University of Missouri, where a lot of the members of the football team almost boycotted a championship game out of sympathy for some of the minority grad students on their campuses. It's true, a lot of these incidents are starting in response to racial incidents on campus. And several of them, they also revolve a lot around athlete pay. And it's raising some good challenges for institutions now about how they have to think about athletes. Are they students? Are they people who have First Amendment rights? Are they pre-professional people on their campuses? It's interesting, though, to us, though, because a lot of what we hear about is these protests sort of in a confrontational light and an activist light. There have also been some protests. In this case, this is a picture, actually, that was taken from Kent State at a basketball game where the athletes on the team were all asked to go out into the audience, find someone from a different race than their own, or someone who they thought was from a different race than their own, bring them onto the court and sort of demonstrate, a little kumbaya moment of like a brotherhood of man thing. And so we're seeing that these activist athlete issues are not just sort of in-your-face notions. In some cases, they're activism in the act of healing as well. The safety net. This is a really huge issue. By the safety net, we mean colleges are really starting to confront issues of poverty and hunger and homelessness on their campuses. Some of these statistics really should be startling to all of us here. This survey, the 12-state survey that we're citing here above, was a survey of 8 community colleges and 26 four-year colleges. As you can see, these startling numbers: 1 out of 5 gone hungry, 1 out of 10 had been homeless at some point in the last year. Nearly half of the students called themselves food or housing insecure, which means they couldn't pay for rent or groceries. Colleges are reacting to this. In some cases, as you see, colleges are creating food banks and coming up with other responses. And they've also taken some action sort of on a policy front. Some colleges in California have begun to allow students who are on SNAP, what we used to call food stamps, are allowing students on SNAP to use their SNAP benefits in the campus dining halls, but that's still a pretty small number of campuses. There's also some people who are sort of pushing this notion, which might find a tough run in the current political climate, but just sort of expanding the whole notion of the school lunch program into maybe the same school lunch program that now provides meals to students in poverty in elementary school and high schools. There should be some version of that at the higher education level, too. Frankly, I've been coming to this GSV conference for a number of years now, and I hear a lot of ideas about innovation. I would love to hear some ideas about innovation, innovative ideas, for profit, nonprofit, whatever, that sort of get at this safety net problem, because it is a huge problem at colleges and around our country. Cybersecurity rising. By this we mean America does not have enough people to work in the cybersecurity fields as it needs to meet the demand. The demand is growing, the supply is not. It sort of sounds simple, but it's a little more complicated than that. Because here, as it was in the case with the fake news issues, there's a question of preparation. It's not just getting more students to learn coding and then the problem gets solved. This is just a chart, by the way, that sort of shows the demand versus the supply. The darker gray is 2011. The yellowish ones are 2015. The chart on the left is for all graduates. The chart on the right is BA only. Don't worry so much about the numbers. Just look at the bars. We're not filling these needs. And one of the reasons that we're not filling the needs, particularly in cybersecurity, is, as I said, it's not just about needing people who can do coding. To be a really good expert in cybersecurity, someone has to be a person who really understands geopolitical issues, understands history, understands current events, and understands politics. Those are not often skills that are taught necessarily in the engineering school or in the computer science department. The real experts in computer security and cybersecurity are going to be people who can blend both the humanities and the social science skills, particularly the social sciences, with the technical skills. And that's a really big challenge right now for colleges to meet that demand. It's...
I don't understand that connection.
Because you have to understand where the threats are coming from. So it's one thing to sort of read the code and understand the code and see there's a hole in the code. It's another thing to anticipate the kinds of what's happening in the world and why, to take a current example, maybe this one was somewhat obvious, but it's, people were predicting several days before the French election that Macron's accounts were going to be hacked, right? And so that you didn't have to know that you didn't have to just be a cybersecurity person. You had to understand following the events out of Putin's government to understand where that was coming from. That might be a little bit more of an obvious one because just about everyone expected that hack to happen. But if you're not following what's happening in parts of the world that are not getting this blanket attention, you can still be subject to hacks. And it helps to have people in your at companies, and frankly, colleges are very vulnerable themselves to this. I was talking to a cybersecurity person the other day who works for a defense contractor. He said he used to work for the government, so I think that meant he used to work for the CIA. And he told me a lot of the hacks that they find in their company kind of come initially through universities because universities are not as secure as other places. And so it looks like universities are the sources of these hacks, but it's really not. It's people kind of invading through the universities' systems. By the way, there's some seats up here in the front if people want to not stand, or there's some seats around here. Thanks. Next trend is something we've called sanctuary campus. You've heard, I'm assuming a lot of people have heard the phrase sanctuary city. This is sort of the campus version of that, where colleges, in some cases driven by their own interests, in some cases pushed by their students and faculty members, have tried to declare themselves a sanctuary campus, meaning that they will provide protections for undocumented students in some way or other. Frankly, it's a dicey term because there is no definition of a sanctuary campus, and there's no really strong legal protection for being a sanctuary campus. But it does reflect somewhat of the interest that's out there among people in higher education to sort of stand up for immigrants, particularly immigrant students who are covered under the deferred action regulations from the Obama administration. It's also interesting to note that there's been a little bit of a backlash to some of the sanctuary movements, not just on campuses, but sort of nationally. I think yesterday in Texas, the governor signed the law to prohibit sanctuary cities in Texas, and many colleges are starting to get some heat in state legislatures about this too for their efforts to create sanctuary cities. So I think we're going to continue to see this movement and this backlash to this movement become a nice point of tension for colleges. Which leads quite naturally to the next trend that we saw. This one might almost be like the mega trend of the year. We've called it kind of the cultural divide. Colleges, along with a lot of places in America, colleges were very surprised by the outcomes of the last election. There was a sense, I think, in higher education that the voters were not respecting some of the values that we think of, or that we we in traditional higher education tend to think of representing the values of higher education. And that sent a bit of a shock to higher education leaders. A lot of people are starting to look back and say, are we really serving our communities as well as we should be? The Chronicle has been running a bunch of articles since the election. I think we under this notion Trump's America, where we have been going to visit places like North Carolina and looking a little bit more at this cultural divide and trying to understand why the values that higher ed thinks it reflects, don't really match up with the values in its community, where the mismatch is and where the misunderstandings are. And as you see here, it's kind of created some interesting efforts on college campuses. Diversity efforts in higher ed have been traditionally oriented around race, ethnicity, and economic issues. It's expanding a little bit, even to just a little bit more of a urban versus a rural thing. I think there's this notion that higher ed has not really, in many places, is not really understanding what's happening in rural parts of the country, and also maybe some of the manufacturing hubs of the country that have been a lot more devastated by the effects of the economy than many higher ed people have understood. This quote in red here is a quote from an 18-year-old, it's from an essay in our trends report, from an 18-year-old student from a rural school, from a rural environment, who said, he didn't think his college necessarily understood where he was coming from. And I think colleges are starting to understand that, and even to the point where they're studying the working class as a notion. It sounds a little silly in some respects, but it's perhaps a start. Diversity, the traditional notion of what we think about as, what we have thought about as diversity in higher education. A lot of you recall in the last year or two, I guess 2 years ago at this point, the United States Supreme Court in the Fisher case upheld the use of affirmative action in college admissions, but was very clear to say that it needed to be, if it was going to be used, it needed to be upheld with precise goals and with legitimate reason. Colleges couldn't just declare themselves having an affirmative action policy with no grounds or basis for it. They had to sort of explain it and justify it with numbers, hard data, and explain this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is where we feel we're deficient, and here's how we expect to use affirmative action to rectify our past challenges. That's the sort of the state of play right now in affirmative action. They're certainly legal, but it needs to be justified. And frankly, we've heard a lot about big data at this conference and in a lot of other techie conferences. Big data is actually coming into play in the discussions about affirmative action. We're seeing colleges using big data strategies to help understand where they're falling short on the traditional areas of diversity recruiting. It's interesting, I also came across this again at University of Texas. University of Texas, they're also taking it a step further. They're also using a lot of these diversity thinking in hiring on faculty and staff positions in a much more aggressive way than they had before. I've been intrigued by the big data uses of it. This thing we reference here, this geo-index that the University of Washington has been using, they basically kind of created this giant matrix where they take into account, they use a score and they take into account ethnicity, economic income, geographic diversity, and they kind of create almost a formula for sort of understanding how diverse their class is and helping to sort of quantify what they're doing in admissions. So they're taking a real effort at it. And at UT Austin, where obviously it matters quite a bit, they have some professors looking very deeply at diversity, not just, attack the mic, not just diversity writ large at the whole institution, but diversity class by class, because there have been a lot of studies that have talked about that's really where the best benefits of these diversity efforts come in the classroom day to day, where students are faced with ideas and they have to confront their ideas in the company of classmates who are not coming from things exactly where they're coming from. Reckoning with history. Click us ahead for a second here. So we've heard a little bit about this issue on campuses. A lot of colleges have been dealing with the fact that many of them were founded or managed to sort of stay alive on the backs of slavery. They, in some cases, most famously, in this case in Georgetown University, Georgetown recently got some prominence because it came to light that the university had actually managed to avoid insolvency by selling some of the slaves it owned. This is a ship's manifest that lists the name of 272 slaves that Georgetown sold in 1838 to a buyer in New Orleans. Georgetown's now taken actions on this effort in the same way that colleges in the past have gone back and looked at their history and looked at their discrimination against Jews, against gays, and against faculty members from the McCarthy era. The new era of this sort of reconciliation, I guess, sort of looking back on slavery. Georgetown, as many of you have read, is actually offering, special admissions criteria now to descendants of the slaves that it sold back in the 1800s. Title IX due process. We all know we've been reading a lot about Title IX cases over the past few years. It seems like Title IX issues are coming up more and more on campus, sexual harassment issues. Those of you who follow the Chronicle know we even started something we call the Title IX tracker, where you could go online and, if you want to get depressed, see how many colleges have open investigations right now from the U.S. Department of Education, where they're being investigated for Title IX violations. That, by the way, has sort of prompted a backlash. I think in some cases we're starting to see now some of the students who've been accused of misconduct, mostly the men, in fact, are fighting back. They're actually, in some cases, suing their institution. And I apologize, I can't remember the school, but I think a student like last week just won $1 million or something like that from his campus from when he said being wrongfully accused of sexual harassment on campuses. So we're sort of seeing what I guess in some cases you might call a correction, depending on where you're coming from on this issue, about the sexual harassment issue. Particularly under the civil rights rubrics. Where this is headed now is also a really interesting question. the Title IX enforcement became a really big priority under the Obama administration. Catherine Lanham was the U.S. Undersecretary of Education for Civil Rights, and she and her led an office that was made it very clear that they were going to be pursuing cases for transgender students who felt discriminated against, for women students, male students, gay students. They took a very sort of, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but they took a very activist, perhaps, approach towards dealing with cases of Title IX allegations. There's now a new acting assistant secretary for civil rights. She has a very different background. Actually, when she was a student at Stanford, she's since come out and said that she's white, and she said she was discriminated against at Stanford because she was white. And so I think the tone of the civil rights enforcement might change dramatically under the Trump administration and under Secretary DeVos. I mean, we don't know this yet for a fact. We haven't seen any direct evidence of this other than the department had, the administration has withdrawn some guidance that it had given out earlier on civil rights violations, civil rights enforcement for transgender students. We haven't seen that many direct actions yet specifically out of the education department, but I promise you we're watching, and I'm sure a lot of you are watching also. I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of colleges would be very happy if the department lessened, sort of pulled back on the gas on that a little bit. I think a lot of colleges have felt that the U.S. Department of Education has been too aggressive in the way it's approaching civil rights investigations and has been applying I don't know if I should call it too low a standard, too high a standard, but a different standard than a legal standard. And so I think this is also one of these places where the civil rights enforcement is going to be a place we're going to be watching very closely. This is our last trend, and it's really more of a trend in academe than it is sort of broadly, but it's a fascinating one for us because a lot of disciplines have been dealing with issues of harassment, sexual harassment in particular. In certain disciplines, it seems that for some reason, I think philosophy tends to be one. There's a lot of cases where, and obviously in some of the science fields, women graduate students and women professors feel they're getting harassed a lot more by their male professors. And we've seen a lot of these instances on campuses and within disciplinary societies where the societies are now starting to say, you know what, this is our problem. This is not just a bad actor kind of issue, that this might be something our discipline itself needs to deal with and sort of take action on it. It's very funny, actually. The American Geophysical Union, at their conference last year, they actually put up these signs during the conference. Apparently these are somewhat boozy events where people sort of go a little, what happens at the AGU meeting stays at the AGU meeting, and certainly in other disciplinary societies also. And so they've actually sort of taken it to be part of their formal process right now where they put up signs and make people know and understand that harassment is unwelcome and unwanted. And they're, in some cases, ending some of these boozy events, and they're having putting on hikes or things like that as part of their events to sort of change the scholarly meanings a little bit. And in some cases, some of the journals have even gone ahead and banned people who have found to have been harassers have been banned from publishing in the journals. It may not sound like it's an issue that's something that's here for the GSV meeting, but I mean, certainly the things we've been reading a lot about some of the culture at some of the tech companies, certainly not ed tech companies, but some of the tech companies obviously have some of these culture issues. And so even though you may not think this is an issue for you, I think it's probably worth looking back on your culture at your own institutions and at your own companies and in your own organizations to make sure you don't actually have some of the same challenges that some of these societies have. Okay, I promised to be quick on this, so those are our trends for 2017. Folks, what do you think? If I run them down real quickly, quick show of hands. You can raise your hand 3 times. This is like the most low-tech version of this polling. I'm just going to run through these real quickly, and just raise your hand up to 3 times if you think it's a trend that's a challenge that you're hearing about, concerned about, fascinated by, intrigued by, just if it sort of resonates with you in some way. So I'll just run through them real quickly. Information literacy. Huge. Activist athletes, not so much. Safety net. Okay, you know what? More hands should go up. Cybersecurity rising. Sanctuary campus. Cultural divide. Defending diversity. Reckoning with history. Title IX due process. Harassment vigilance. I think I've been able to present this to one or two other fora, and I think where you guys land is exactly where other people have landed as well. I'd be happy to take some questions now on this, and also, as I said, yeah, so, sir. Oh, wait, we even have a microphone, hang on a second. And I should say I'm happy to take questions, but I didn't write all of these things, so I may not be able to give you the definitive answer on all of it. And also, let me please remind you, if you didn't get a copy of this, give us your card or some scribble on a piece of paper or something, and let us know that you want it, and we'll be sure to get you a copy.
So it just, as I look at this group, this list, it just seems to me that a lot of them are really closely related. Like sanctuary campus, cultural divide, defending diversity, Title IX due process, harassment vigilance, and to a certain extent reckoning with history. They're all really, really related. So if you had to come up with like the next 2 or 3 that aren't from this list to round, if you really needed to round out 10, what are 2 or 3 more that you're seeing?
You want us to start reporting next year's report already, huh? I'll let Scott Carlson over there is going to volunteer to bail me out on this one for a second. Employment and employment and the college's role in the path to employment. Definitely a huge issue. I think the only reason, and I just put this list back up there because I think it does sort of reflect this kind of change, that this year's much more of an outward sort of colleges as sort of a crucible of national issues more so than in the previous year where it was, I think, very much of a list that was much more insular. I think that's one of the most salient things about these 2 trends lists from this year to next year. Actually, let me turn that question around. Scott.
I'll give you another one. I'll bail you out again.
Go, man, go.
The survivability of small colleges.
Huge. Okay, so someone take notes because we're going to assign those 2 for Scott's going to take one next year. I'll take the other. Does anyone else have a question or a thought that they would want to put on this list as well? What did we miss this year? Oh, and the mic is coming, great.
Loan default rates.
And the whole student loan, we write about that a lot at the Chronicle. We also find there's a lot of misinformation out there about the loan default rates because that number people like to throw around, $1.3 trillion in debt. Obviously, that is a big, scary number. But when you divide that number up into some of its components, 40% of it being for graduate debt, and some of those other, and the biggest default problems being not so much students with big loans, but needy students with small loans but still can't pay them off. That seems to be where the biggest problem in our economy is right now.
I would add community colleges for that.
Community and debts at community. Yeah, students at community colleges actually are only now beginning to sort of even take out student debt. Up until recently, they weren't doing that. Though obviously, I think that gets back to the safety net challenge. Though frankly, I mean, not here to preach, but it is a huge issue on a lot of campuses, and it's not one that gets the attention it deserves a lot of times. Yes.
Hi, anything particular you would highlight for non-traditional universities or adult learners, besides the growing number of them?
Question right close to my heart. I was just talking about that with my colleagues here. No, I think some of the challenge, and it fits a little bit with what Scott just identified with the role of colleges in the path to employment. I think colleges are going to be having a much bigger role in retraining adults, either the students who were their students initially or the students who have never been to college before. I think that's going to have a huge impact on the shape of higher education, on the way colleges look. So I think a lot of traditional colleges are going to become what you've described as non-traditional colleges. A lot more colleges are going to become adult serving in a much more aggressive way. I don't know if we know exactly what that means. I don't know if they do, if they know what that means at this point yet, but there's certainly some, this is not going to happen next year, but that's like a 5 to 10 year trend, I would say. Maybe people have a different feeling about that, but I feel like that trend is going to definitely be rolling through higher education in a lot of ways. There's a question back there, but oh, great.
How about college promises? A lot of talk
Oh, the
about
free
that
college?
first year of college, free.
It's certainly not going to come out of the federal government, but it's been interesting to me to see the program in New York. I think Rhode Island is on the cusp of adopting a program as well. There's some efforts in California still cooking around. There's a lot of these college promise programs at communities and localities. It does seem like the debate over free college helped at least change the conversation a little bit. I don't know that it's fair to say that free college is now an acceptable idea, but this notion of up to 2 years of college might become, we might start thinking of like the first 2 years of post-secondary education as something that's, if not mandatory, but sort of something that is something that needs to be more of a government-provided program or a government-assisted program. I think that is working its way through the landscape. But it's very hard to imagine this Congress adopting free college anytime before 2018. Yeah.
I think a big thing for the coming year is actually going to be exactly what you said, the Congress and the administration, and what on earth are they going to do?
One big year for the year is what on earth is the Congress and the administration going to do? Yeah, does anyone know that answer? Because then we could do it right now. That'd be great. It'll be fascinating to know. Just really quickly, the most obvious things, we do know that we expect a lot of action to come out of the Senate committees, in particular, the Senate Help Committee. But we also know that the Senate Help Committee's first job is going to probably be the healthcare law. And so I don't know how high a priority higher education will have in the next year or two in Congress. There are certainly some challenges. There's a lot of push on loan reform right now, to the question in the back and some others. I think there's a lot of people eager for Congress to kind of take a bite at this. I think a lot of people maybe in traditional higher education, though, frankly, are looking at the political makeup of this Congress and might just be just as happy if they waited a couple of years and it wasn't quite, certainly if it wasn't quite the hard right Congress of the House. I think traditional higher education would probably feel more comfortable with the political makeup of a Congress that was a little different when it came to legislating rules for higher education. All right, I think let's end this here now, because I really appreciate everybody coming. And you can still catch the last few minutes of another session. As I said, if you didn't get a copy of this report, please give us your card or something, and we'll be sure you get one, PDF you or something like that. And thank you all for coming, and have a great conference. Come find us. Thank you.